A tent glows orange at the edge of a landing ground that does not appear on most maps. Inside, men are laughing. German voices and Italian voices, folded together over cards and cognac, the ordinary noise of an airfield mess on a quiet December night in the Libyan desert. Outside, in the dark, 6 men are counting paces to the door. They have been 3 days getting here. Across open desert, with no front line behind them to retreat to, riding in trucks built for a unit most of the British Army does not yet know exists. One of them is carrying a pistol he has not fired at a man before. He is about to. This is not a story about a lone hero tearing an air force apart with his bare hands. That version exists. It has circulated for most of 80 years, printed and reprinted, and it is not quite true. This is a story about what a handful of men, a new kind of bomb, and a deliberately misleading name did to a German and Italian airfield in about an hour, and about how much of what came after was legend stacked on top of a much stranger, much smaller fact. The story most people know goes like this. Robert Blair Paddy Mayne, an Irish rugby international turned soldier, walked onto Tamet airfield on the night of 14th December 1941, ran out of bombs partway through, and simply began ripping the instrument panels out of German aircraft with his hands, disabling 24 planes single-handed. It is a magnificent image. On the documentary record, it is incomplete in almost every direction that matters. To understand what actually happened there, you have to go back, not weeks, but years, to a hospital bed in Alexandria, a badly worded memorandum, and a training accident that nearly ended the unit before its name existed. The raid Mayne led was not a solo act. It depended on a bomb invented by a man few people outside the regiment have ever heard of, on a navigation unit that had spent a decade mapping dunes for the pleasure of it, and on a piece of deliberate deception written into the unit's own name. And the number most often repeated, the 24 aircraft, turns out, when checked against wreckage counts the Axis itself compiled weeks later, to be one of the least reliable figures in the whole story. Why did 6 unsupported men manage, in roughly an hour, what larger conventional attacks on Rommel's own airfields further east had failed to manage in months? Not better weapons, not greater numbers, not plain luck. The real answer takes longer to reach, and it starts earlier than the airfield. David Stirling was 25 in June 1941, a Scots Guards officer with a reputation, among the men who knew him, for being spectacularly lazy. He had belonged to a commando formation called Lay Force, disbanded that spring after achieving little on the Mediterranean coast, and he was recovering badly from an unauthorized parachute jump near Mersa Matruh that had left him temporarily paralyzed from the waist down. For 2 months, in the Alexandria Scottish Hospital, he had nothing to do but think. He emerged with a memorandum, small teams of 4, each man a specialist in weapons, explosives, navigation or signals, dropped by parachute deep behind German and Italian lines to hit airfields, fuel dumps, and the roads that fed them. He could not get past the front desk at General Headquarters in Cairo to deliver it, so he climbed the perimeter fence, found the office of the Deputy Commander-in-Chief, Lieutenant General Neil Ritchie, and talked his way past a sentry on crutches. Ritchie read it. General Sir Claude Auchinleck approved it. The new unit was given a name built to lie. L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade, as though it were one small piece of a full airborne brigade that, in the autumn of 1941, did not exist at all. The deception was meant for Axis intelligence. For a while, it worked just as well on the British. This is the kind of story that rarely gets told in full. Stay with Britain Glory for more of the record behind the legend. Cabret Camp, on the edge of the Suez Canal, was 3 tents and 65 men by August 1941. Training fell to a second lieutenant named John Steele Lewis, Jock, to everyone who knew him, an Oxford rowing blue raised in Australia, methodical to the point of severity, who built a program of night marches, live fire, and demolitions rigorous enough to kill at least 1 recruit before the unit had seen a single German. It was Lewis, working largely alone with stolen ordnance components, who solved the problem the whole plan depended on: how 4 men on foot could carry enough explosive power to destroy an aircraft. His answer: plastic explosive packed with diesel oil and thermite, molded into a charge barely larger than a fist, would burn through an engine block and set the surrounding fuel alight in the same motion. Within months, it was standard issue across the unit. It still carries his name. None of it had been tested against a live target when the unit received its first mission. Operation Squatter, on the stormy night of 16 and 17 November 1941, sent roughly 60 men in 5 sticks by parachute against German airfields near Gazala, timed to support the opening of Operation Crusader, the British offensive to relieve the besieged garrison at Tobruk. A gale was blowing that night hard enough to scatter the drop across miles of open rock. Containers of weapons and explosives were lost on landing. Only 2 of 11 were ever recovered, and men were dragged across stone by parachutes they could not collapse fast enough. By the time survivors reached the rendezvous, accounts differ on the precise figure, but something between 21 and 22 of roughly 60 had made it back. Not one of them had fired a shot at the enemy. It is worth granting, before going further, how good the opposition actually was. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps was, by that winter, arguably the most tactically flexible armoured force in any theatre of the war, expert at concentrating strength at what German doctrine called the Schwerpunkt, literally the heavy point, the single spot on a battlefield where committing everything available would decide the outcome. Its supply system, thin and constantly improvised, was kept running by officers who had learned to expect chaos and plan around it rather than against it. Its airfields, strung along the coast road between Tripoli and Benghazi, were guarded on the working assumption that no organized force could cross the open desert to their undefended southern flank and arrive with anything left to fight with. The German and Italian order of battle had a category for commandos landed by sea and a category for aircraft attacking from above. It did not yet have one for 6 men who had simply walked in, from the one direction everybody had assumed was empty. That assumption was the single thing that did not hold. Major Ralph Bagnold, a peacetime desert explorer who had spent the 1920s and 1930s mapping the interior of the Libyan desert for no reason more urgent than curiosity, had founded the Long Range Desert Group in 1940 specifically to move men and vehicles through terrain the German and Italian armies considered impassable. His sun compass, adapted from an instrument he had built for his own pre-war expeditions, let a driver hold a bearing across open sand with no landmarks and no fixed horizon to steer by. After Squatter, Stirling abandoned parachutes for good and simply asked Bagnold's drivers to take his men there instead. By the time 3 trucks carrying Stirling's raiding parties left the oasis at Jalo on 8 December, the men riding in them made an unlikely portrait of British Special Forces. David Stirling, 26 that winter, moved through the Desert War with a reputation for vagueness that his own officers found almost comic. He forgot faces, mislaid maps, dozed in meetings, and used it deliberately as camouflage for a mind that missed almost nothing when it counted. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, who would go on to command the 8th Army through the war's turning point at El Alamein, later summed him up in 5 words that mocked and forgave him in the same breath. Quite mad, quite mad. Jock Lewes, 28, was the opposite kind of contradiction. Precise to the point of coldness on the training ground, he wrote home about the unit he and Stirling had built together with something close to tenderness. In a letter that survives him, the SAS's training officer put it plainly. Together we have fashioned this unit. David has established it without, and I think I may say I have established it within. Within 3 weeks of writing that sentence, the bomb he had designed would make him quietly famous inside a unit of 60 men and almost no one else. And the same desert would kill him before the story of his own invention had finished being told. Robert Blair Mayne, 26, was a Newtownards solicitor and an Ireland Rugby international recruited, according to unit legend, almost directly out of a cell where he was awaiting court-martial for striking a superior officer. He drank hard, read poetry in his tent, and by the account of men who served under him, killed at close range with a calm that unsettled soldiers who already considered themselves hardened. Bill Fraser, a Scots Guards lieutenant not yet 30, commanded the smallest and least publicised of the 3 raiding parties. He left almost no personal writing behind and appears in almost no post-war memoir. He would prove, on the record the Axis itself later compiled, to be the most honestly reported officer of the 3. His men's claims, when checked, came closest to what wreckage crews actually found on the ground. And on the other side of the wire, at a headquarters hundreds of miles to the east, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded an army that had, in 8 months, pushed the British back across Cyrenaica twice. He was, by the testimony of officers who fought against him and admired almost nothing else about the war they were in, a genuinely brilliant tactician, decisive, personally fearless, openly contemptuous of the racial ideology his government fought under, even as he served it without resigning his command. Nothing in his training, his instincts, or his supply reports had prepared him for an enemy that arrived on foot, from the one direction his own maps told him was safe. Picture the geometry of that night before the shooting starts. 3 raiding parties, 1 shared jump-off point, and no way for any of them to know how the others were doing once the trucks pulled away into the dark. The 3 parties split at last, light on 14th of December, each briefed to hit a different airfield along the coast road and be back at the rendezvous by the following dawn. Stirling toward Sirte, Fraser toward the airfield complex at Agadir, Mayne, with 4 men, a stock of Lewis bombs and a Colt automatic he had carried since fighting in Syria, toward Tamet. By 10 that night, Mayne's group had covered the last stretch on foot, weapons wrapped in cloth to keep them from rattling, and reached the airfield perimeter without being challenged. They found the mess tent first, laughter, cigarette smoke, a mixture of Italian and German voices. Mayne later set down the moment in an account he gave for the regiment's own history, describing how he walked to the entrance with 2 other men, a Tommy gun raised beside him. I kicked open the door and stood there with my Colt 45, the others at my side with a Tommy gun and another automatic, he recalled. I said, "Good evening." 2 words. In the account of a man not otherwise given to understatement, those 2 words are doing an enormous amount of work, the last ordinary sentence spoken in that tent, before it stopped being ordinary. A German officer rose from his seat, moving backward. Mayne shot him. He turned and fired at another man 6 feet away. What followed inside the tent lasted well under a minute and killed most of the men in it. Outside again, the team worked the dispersal lines, rows of parked aircraft, spaced apart deliberately so that fire could not jump from one machine to the next. Lewis bombs went onto wing roots and cockpits, fused for a few minutes delay, one after another down the line. When the bombs ran out with aircraft still standing untouched, Mayne began wrenching instrument panels out of the remaining cockpits by hand, disabling machines he no longer had explosive left to destroy outright. 14 aircraft went up in flames that could be counted from where the raiding party withdrew. Another 10 were left with their cockpits torn open, grounded rather than incinerated. In the retelling that circulated for decades afterward, all 24 simply became destroyed, a rounding that turned an already remarkable night into something larger still. No SAS soldier was hit. Mayne's team walked out the way they had walked in. 100 miles or so to the northwest, Stirling's party hit the airfield at Sirte the same night. Adding to a total the unit's own after-action report would eventually put at roughly 61 aircraft, across 3 targets, without losing a single man. Fraser's party at Agadir claimed 37. When Axis wreckage recovery crews compiled their own tally of aircraft found on captured airfields some weeks later, the number actually present at Agadir came to about 25, a serious night's work by any reasonable measure, just not quite the one that made it into the newspapers. 2 weeks later, on the night of 26 and 27 December, Jock Lewes led his own party against an airfield near Nephilia, further west along the coast. It did not go the way Tamet had gone. The aircraft on the ground were dispersed wide instead of lined in neat rows, and the garrison was already alert. His team destroyed 1 aircraft. 1. The method that had worked so cleanly at Tamet, walk in fast, work fast, leave before the alarm catches up, had met a defense that, in 2 weeks, had already adjusted. They were still withdrawing on 30th December, riding with the long-range desert group's trucks near the stone monument at El Agaila, the men called Marble Arch, when enemy aircraft found the convoy in the open and came down low along the track. Lewes was hit by cannon fire in the leg. He died where he fell, in the sand beside the road he had helped invent a way to reach. He was 28. Listen, for a moment, to how the losing side described what had been done to them, rather than to the men who did it. The most useful assessments of what had happened that December did not come from the unit itself. They came from the men who had to explain the damage afterward, in reports nobody outside their own chain of command was ever meant to read. Field Marshal Rommel, writing in the papers he left behind, later edited into a memoir by the military historian Basil Liddell Hart, described the effect of the unit born out of that December on the wider Desert War. Of Stirling specifically, captured more than a year later, he recorded that the British had lost the very able and adaptable commander of the desert group SAS, which had caused us more damage than any other British unit of equal strength. Equal strength. Not equal ambition, not equal reputation. Strength. a career Wehrmacht field marshal, measuring the SAS against every other formation of comparable size Britain had put into the desert, and ranking it first for damage inflicted. That is not really a compliment. It reads closer to a confession that his own intelligence staff had never built a category wide enough to contain what these men were doing to him. A version of that same confusion recurs, in slightly different words, across several German and Italian accounts of the raiding campaign that followed Tamet. Garrison officers radioing rear headquarters to report that a landing had taken place, that Royal Navy commandos had come ashore in force, that aircraft were strafing from overhead, descriptions built to match an attack on a scale the defenders could actually picture. On more than one of these nights, the real attacking force numbered 6 men on foot. It was not that the defenders were foolish. It was that nothing in their training had prepared them to believe 6 men could do this much damage in an hour. So their own reports reached for a bigger story that made more sense of what they were looking at. I have not found a German or Italian document that uses the phrase, "no category for this," in those exact words, but reading the panicked radio logs against what was actually found on the ground the next morning, it is difficult to describe the gap between them any other way. Neither, in a different sense, did the unit's own chroniclers ever quite find the right category for it. Virginia Cowell's 1958 biography of Stirling, The Phantom Major, was commissioned by Stirling himself 3 years after Mayne's death, meaning the one man best placed to correct the record about that night at Tamet was no longer alive to do it. The book set the tone for how the whole campaign would be remembered afterward: heroic, individual, slightly larger at every retelling than the report that had preceded it. The historian Saul David, revisiting the book in a 2022 reassessment, called it full of inaccuracies, half-truths, and downright lies. Half-truths. Not lies outright. The raid happened, the aircraft burned, the men Mayne shot in that tent were real men whose names the record barely preserved. What inflated over 8 decades was not the fact of the fire, it was the shape people needed the fire to take. Stirling did not last through the campaign he had started. Captured in Tunisia on 10 January 1943, when a special German unit ambushed his column, he briefly escaped into the desert with local guides before being handed back to his captors, sold, in one widely repeated account, for a quantity of tea. 4 escape attempts from Italian and German prison camps followed. He spent the rest of the war at Colditz, the supposedly escape-proof castle reserved for persistent prisoners, and came home in 1945 to find the regiment he had built already hardening into legend without him. Mayne took command in his absence, led the unit through Sicily, mainland Italy, and finally France and Germany, and finished the war with 4 distinguished service orders, a record matched by almost no other British officer of his rank. A 5th honour, the Victoria Cross, was recommended after an action near Oldenburg in April 1945 and downgraded before it could be awarded. The question of why has been argued by historians and members of Parliament for 80 years and has never been settled. He went home to Newtownards, practiced law quietly, rarely discussed the war, and died alone in a car accident on the 14th of December 1955, 14 years, to the calendar day, after he had knocked on a tent door in the Libyan desert and said good evening. Fraser survived the war and largely disappeared from its histories, remembered today, when he is remembered at all, as the SAS's most reliable and least celebrated officer. Rommel never learned how the story would eventually be told. Implicated, fairly or not, the record still argues over how much he actually knew. In the July 1944 plot against Hitler, he was given a choice between a public trial that would have destroyed his family along with him and a private death by poison. He chose the poison in October 1944 and was buried with full military honours by the same government that had just killed him. Set what happened to each of them afterwards side by side, and the tidy ending the legend once stops holding together almost immediately. What is left, once the legend is peeled back to the paperwork, is smaller than the story and, in its way, stranger. Not one man tearing an Air Force apart with his bare hands alone, though that happened too, for 10 aircraft's worth of torn-out instrument panels, which is itself not a small thing. A new bomb, tested for the first time under fire. A navigation unit built by a man who loved sand dunes for their own sake. A deceptive name on a memorandum nobody in Cairo was supposed to actually read. And 6 men who understood that the desert their enemy trusted to protect him was, itself, the Schwerpunkt, the one point on the entire map where simply showing up would matter more than anything they could have carried in with them. This is not a story about a nation needing its heroes to be flawless. It survived 80 years because flawless was easier to print than 5 separate, imperfect, verifiable facts. Somewhere in a tent that no longer exists, on a night now more than 8 decades gone, a man who would die on its anniversary opened a door, said 2 ordinary words, and made them the last ordinary words anyone in that room would ever hear. The paperwork still argues about how many aircraft burned afterward. It has never once argued about the door.